Okay, so welcome to this week's episode of the Path Less Chosen pod, the podcast showing the careers they don't teach you about in school. I'm Sol.
I'm Jamie.
And today we have Jamie Wace, who is founder of Talamo, a dyslexia screening company. They're trying to break the stigma on dyslexia by getting more kids screened between the ages of 7 to 16, helping to understand the child's profile, dyslexia, and how you can help them. So, Jamie, definitely a topic that I know a little bit about through myself and my brother, and you are kind of involved in loosely as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's lots to get into, to be honest. From what he's told us so far, I just know that he's developed this AI system for identifying dyslexia over the last couple of years. Been tested on loads of people, but now he's going to be partnering with schools coming up in September. So it seems a really interesting entrepreneurial journey in an industry that, like you say, there's a bit of stigma around it. And he's admitted to us already that he's made lots of mistakes along the way. So just in terms of his journey, I think there should be some fascinating takeaways to come from it.
Yeah, a very interesting industry, and also seems like an interesting guy. So looking forward to getting on. Let's do it.
Welcome, Jamie, to the Path Less Chosen pod then. So to begin with, just give us a bit of an overview about what Talamo actually is doing.
So I think to describe Talamo, it probably makes sense to just because it's slightly niche. It makes sense to talk a little bit about kind of how it came about. But I'm dyslexic. It's something that I used to sort of struggle with at school. I wasn't until I was about 15, 16, I wasn't that great at school. And I think in hindsight, it was because of my dyslexia. But after I got my diagnosis, I sort of understood a little bit more about my brain. And I think I've been on a bit of an upward trajectory ever since then. And so I worked for a while in the corporate world, but I was always kind of thinking about whether or not I wanted to do something different. And so this kind of idea around dyslexia sort of came up again. So I started looking into the space a lot more. And one of the statistics that jumped off the page for me was that 80% of dyslexic school children are not diagnosed by the time they leave school. And when you actually dig into the details of that, you find that the reason for that is because it's very expensive to get a diagnosis. It's not that these people who do the diagnosis are charging lots of money. It's just it takes a long time to do it. It takes sort of 3 hours to do an assessment, 12 hours to write a report. And so you're ending up spending £500-600. And what that basically means is that those who don't have the means don't get a diagnosis. And so that began the journey of Talamo, thinking about how we could make an automated dyslexia test. And so what we've basically done is created an automated dyslexia screening and cognitive profile test, which basically means that we tell you whether or not you have a risk of dyslexia. And the idea is that this dramatically reduces the cost of dyslexia identification, as opposed to if somebody was to pay for the more expensive one.
So many things to ask about that journey. Let's almost kick back to school. Like, you're very entrepreneurial now. Was that evident at school as well?
Yeah, I think, interestingly, not necessarily at school, partly because I think I was just playing a lot of sport. And I think I feel like all of my kind of spare time was spent playing sport. But when I got to university, that's when I think there was a bit more of an entrepreneurial muscle, which was starting to get a bit more trained. And so I was at Newcastle University, and at the time when I was there, they didn't have I don't know if you guys, when you were at university, you have a Facebook group where everyone sells tickets to events and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So at Newcastle,
Jamie was the number one poster on that throughout our first year. So
also in Newcastle, where I was at, they didn't actually have one of these pages yet. They were starting to I saw a couple there was one in Manchester, there was one in Bristol, but they didn't have one in Newcastle. And so I made the page for the Newcastle one. And so that started a bit of okay, interesting. There's thousands of people who are joining this page. And then from that, I actually got me and a few others then got involved in a student events company. So we'd have kind of acts come to play at some big events in Newcastle. And I think because of the Facebook page and the fact that we were able to then just create an event off the back of it, or use the Facebook page to help sell tickets for the event, I was okay, wow, you can actually just make money from just business is a thing that you can do that you can make money from. Who knew? And it was because I think I was very naive at that point, but because it wasn't actually a very hard business to run. So you'd get the margins were very good, and it would be quite easy to get people in. And so you'd suddenly just find yourself quite flush with cash, like in the context of like being a uni student. So I think whilst I didn't immediately from university then go on to do a whole load of entrepreneurial stuff straight away, I think there was some kind of idea lodged in my head to be like, okay, this is an interesting path that like I could do at some point.
I guess that's the point where your first discovery that there was maybe a path less chosen. You're doing something different to probably what most students are doing. So what we're interested in this pod is obviously what leads people down that path. But interestingly, you'd already chosen at that point to go to university and study politics, which for most people that go and do that then leads them down maybe a path more chosen. So tell us a little bit about what the purpose of going to uni was for you at the time, if you didn't think about the business side of it beforehand.
For me, because of my dyslexia, I was just very keen to like just tick all the right boxes and just to be like, I had a chip in my shoulder about not being smart enough. And so I think I sort of wanted to prove, I mean, to other people, but also to myself, that I wasn't like, I was clever enough to go to university. I don't think there was a huge amount of foresight for me choosing to do a politics degree. Like I liked doing politics for A level and then I ended up doing a politics degree. But in hindsight, whilst I find it sort of interesting, it wasn't exactly like the most useful degree to have. Like it's not like I have many practical skills that I take away from it. And actually my biggest learning from university was more of a social thing and also doing this sort of business on the side.
So then again, to ask you a bit about why during your path, you had this experience of a bit of like an eye-opener to the entrepreneurial world and you discovered you can make some money while you're at university. But then out of university, you then went on to do another master's in political science, right? And that was at LSE. So tell us a little bit about that next step.
I'm from Devon and I grew up in quite like a sort of sheltered environment, I think. I've also got an older brother who'd done like a lot of sort of, he was like a real kind of go-getter at school, very popular. In terms of like the conventional tropes of someone who's done well and been successful, like he'd like ticked off a lot of those boxes. And so I think whether or not I'd have admitted to myself at the time, I think I was probably trying to be a bit like, okay, I need to do something different to differentiate myself. Whether or not I'd sort of like actually realized that. So I think I was kind of like, I need to go away and do something different. Like I had that kind of mindset. And so when I left uni, I was like, I wanted to go traveling, like I think like a lot of people, but I basically decided to go like just do a solo trip around South America and just sort of like just to try and actually get something from traveling. I was obviously traveling past uni, like I wasn't as keen on just doing like going around and just like drinking or whatever. I wanted to actually go and have a proper experience. But I also wanted to do something which was a bit more vocational as well. So I applied for a scholarship after I'd finished in South America to do it's a Generation UK scholarship. So the UK government basically pay you to go out for 6 months to learn Mandarin. And they sent me to this place called Chongqing, which sounds almost like it's a made up name, but it's not. It's like one of the biggest cities in the world. Like the outer municipality of the city's got like 30 million people in. And so when I was there for 3 months, like Mandarin's obviously like a ridiculously hard language to learn, especially as like somebody who's like as a dyslexic person, not necessarily comes as learning a second language is not something that comes as easily. So I like absolutely hated it for 3 months. And I didn't tell anyone really how much I was hating it at home because I'd like decided to do this and I wanted everyone to think I was like a really intrepid traveler and whatever, but actually like hated it. But I think after the first 3 months, I was like, just sort of got over myself a little bit and was like, okay, I may as well make the best of this. And then it was there, then I was like, I could probably stay. So after the 6 months of learning Mandarin, I obviously got a bit better, but then I booked myself in to live in a homestay in another city for a year with a Chinese family. And from there, I had like an internship with the British Chamber of Commerce. And it was kind of post-Brexit. So there's some interesting stuff going on. Liam Fox, like the Secretary of State for like the Foreign Secretary came out and you got to meet them. And it's quite interesting, but it definitely wasn't something I wanted to do sort of long term. After I did my master's, I kind of got taken down a different route.
How did you actually change from 3 months of hating it to actually throwing yourself into it and loving a different place?
I think, like, without sounding really cliche, like I think that I just sort of got over myself a little bit. Like it's not supposed to be like, not everything's not going to be given to me on a plate. Like it's not going to just be like a really nice, easy experience and I just take some nice pictures for Instagram. Like the part of the benefit of it being, if I'm going to have a good experience here, it's because I'm going to be able to put it, I have to put an effort. I have to go and put myself out there, have to like go and make friends with people who are totally different than me and just get over that and just have I think it's just because I had to change my personality a bit in order for me to like actually have a good time there. Whereas before, I think I was probably a bit too rigid in my thinking to actually understand it. Maybe I was a little bit too arrogant, maybe, to actually properly step out of my comfort zone.
Perfect. And it seems that was a bit of a habit of yours, because you also then ended up working in the US and stuff, right?
When I was in my master's, I had a chat with a guy who ran this quite interesting company, this consultancy company, and we had a good conversation, and he offered me a job, and it was really, really tough, like really long hours. I was quite burnt out, but I felt like I'd learned a lot. And so I felt like I'd risen through the ranks of being like the most junior person at a company to someone who could probably do stuff which is more like freelancery. Like I understood that I could have a skill set which I could then kind of take elsewhere. And so it was at the point at finishing that job where I had the idea, but then like a couple of other people joined me with the idea around Talamo. And then the next job that I had, I was still doing Talamo the whole time. So that was actually based in the US, but most of the time I was based in the UK. I was just working on US hours. Like they knew pretty early on that I was doing this startup, but they were just incredibly supportive. And actually one of my old bosses at that company has now become one of our investors. So I think that really was eye-opening in terms of in this day and age, there's never been a better time for you to be able to like do something that pays the bills and something that you're really passionate about. And I think that one of the problems with some of these kind of like more consultancy type jobs, probably the first job that I had, was that it's so all encompassing that it just sucks all of the time that you have to do anything else. So it's like there's a lot of hours in the day, particularly if you work remotely, and you could spend 3 or 4 hours a day if you were really diligent and you have energy, which a lot of people do in their like sort of early 20s, to try and do something that's really going to like make a difference when you're like late 20s, early 30s, by just putting in the time then. But the problem is if you kind of work at one of these like kind of, I guess, typical consultancies or like investment banking or something like this, people are like, okay, you've got a good salary, but you're so exhausted that you don't really have many, like, your exit routes are restricted to other corporate jobs because you haven't had enough time and energy to invest in like something that might take off in 3 years' time, but you need to consistently work on it a little bit up until that point.
The idea of like exit routes and stuff, I don't think we've really had anyone talk about that so like honestly before, because I think some people may try and like defend like the corporate side, and yeah, they learn a lot from it, but no one ever had in mind while they were doing it what's my exit route going to be. So yeah, just
you mentioned the startup, but I'd love to know when that entrepreneurial idea actually came to you. When did you go, this is a great idea, I'm going to go for it? And then what were your steps like straight after realizing you wanted to do it?
Interesting point. Like, I actually, to be honest, credit someone else with giving me the impetus and the push. And it was like one of the original founders of Talamo, who like he basically didn't have enough time to do it. And this was right at the beginning. We worked on a couple of projects together, and I was reading a bit about dyslexia and just thought it was interesting. And because the type of work that I was doing was like in tech, and it was about like a typical project would be to strategically come up with an idea and then design like an app or a website or a product experience for someone like Nike or Samsung or something like that. And so it was almost like it's quite entrepreneurial in the work that we were doing anyway. And it was because they were relatively small projects. You kind of go right from ideation through to nearing it being executed. So it was kind of like there was a lot of skills being built up in that sort of entrepreneurial vein there. So I kind of like was thinking I could use some of this to start a business, probably in the tech space. And then this guy basically said to me, he was like, you're ready to start a business. And I was just like, I'm not. I need to learn more. I need to do more, like 2 or 3 more years. And he was like, there's no perfect time to do it. And I'm much older now and I have different problems. Like, I have a family and I don't have as much time as you. So you might lack a bit of experience, but you make up with it, having more time and actually being quite naive is a good thing. And so I was extremely naive at the beginning, but actually in a way, I think you have to be a little bit naive to start an ambitious project, because you don't know how difficult it's going to be. And if you did, you probably wouldn't go for it. So I guess it's he sort of opened my eyes and was like, I should go for this. And I think that that's one of the interesting points, is that I speak to people a lot who say, I'm not ready to do this. I need 2 or 3 more years, but there truly is no perfect time to do it. And one of the things that I think the biggest lessons that I've learned is that entrepreneurship is a muscle that you have to train. And it doesn't matter when you start training that muscle. You could be 40, and if you've never started up a business before, you're going to have to learn some of those kind of like very early lessons, whatever age you decide to do it. So if you decide to do it at 21 or 25 or 30 or 35, yes, some of your experiences will help, but there's always going to be things that like you're going to be a complete beginner at that point. So I think that if you're thinking about doing something at some point, do something now. And don't wait for you to be more experienced or something like that. I think that is a facade, and you'll have more worries and time constraints the older you get. So like it's better to do it when you're younger and you have fewer responsibilities.
You say when you had the idea, it was going to be in the tech side of things. But so when did you think actually there's a good overlap here with maybe dyslexia, which comes from a personal experience, and how important did you think that was in developing the idea?
The way that I originally viewed the space was I knew I wanted to do something in dyslexia, and so like the original thing was creating like 20 ideas that we could go down and then choosing one. So it started off with me and this guy who's like no longer with Talamo, but still a friend of mine, and we sort of begun that. And then my boss at this new company I was working with was like, hey, I heard you're doing this. Is a different boss to the one who ultimately invested in us, but this was like more sort of like my direct senior and the person who got me into the company anyway. And I was having dinner with her, and she was like, oh, interesting that you're doing this startup. Like, sounds weird, but like, can I join? Like, it sounds like it's very early, but like, can I? And I was like, quite surprised, because I was like, okay, I guess. And then partly through sort of just, I don't know, we basically split the company in 3, and then we went down that route. And I think this is Sophie, who still is a co-founder at Talamo. She, I would say, is very, very good at separating the wood from the trees. Like she just knows what good looks like. And so, whereas me, I'm more like, I'll just be like a lot of work and loads of stuff. And then it works quite well, because then she's like, it's this one. And we looked at all of the different ideas we could have done, and assessment was the one that we thought was the most interesting, because that's kind of like the point of, if you want to support dyslexic people, identifying dyslexic people is like the first point. But I think that a lot of other companies avoided doing it because it's the most difficult. And I now understand why they avoided it, because it's like, it's not easy. And so we sort of originally wanted to do this like automated dyslexia test. And then we decided against doing it because we thought it was too ambitious. So we then started doing this like, we started for probably about nearly a year, focused on this idea where we were creating a platform to make it easier for these dyslexia assessors to conduct more face-to-face, but virtual assessments. And so we were going to organize when they do the assessment. We were going to set up the time that they could do it. We're going to have a platform so they could show that their tests that they had and things like that. But ultimately, I think what I've learned now is that, number one, it wasn't ambitious enough. And so investors weren't as interested. It was too complicated to explain. It wasn't really solving the real problem. And the business model was too complicated. So we sort of reverted back to this original idea that we had that we thought was too difficult. And this was at the beginning of 2023. And then just sort of ran into that direction. And since we've done that, it's been much more successful. But I think that we sort of, in some ways, your first instincts are right, and you can kind of talk yourself out of things. And actually, I mean, I wonder where we would be now if we just stuck with the first point and we just barreled down that route to begin with. We sort of like became less ambitious in order for us to become more ambitious, I guess.
So yeah, you said you've made a ton of mistakes along the way, and I guess if you had carried on with that one single idea, you know, it might not have been successful. Talk to us a little bit about the other mistakes that you were referring to that you've made along the way, and how important they were to then actually come to where you are now, where you're a lot better product, you're probably still going to make mistakes, but it's going to be a lot more successful.
I think in order for me to sort of frame the mistakes, I need to kind of contextualize a little bit about like what would like the details of what we're doing. One of the problems with Talamo as a business is that it is a dyslexia testing business, like starting off as dyslexia risk assessment screening and then like adding cognitive profiling, blah, blah, blah. But it doesn't MVP very well because you can't really get it wrong when you're testing somebody's children for whether or not they've got dyslexia. Like, this is a label that they might carry for their whole life. And so it doesn't MVP very well because it's kind of a bit irresponsible if you just like chucked something out and just had that wasn't very good and then had people like critique it, which in a way is that's the lean startup methodology, like get something out there, get people to critique it, improve it, and like kind of go through this iterative process of improvement. So we were already in this bad spot where we basically had to do a lot of development before we had any real market validation of whether or not our product was going to work, which from a financial perspective means that we have to raise a lot of money before we've even got anything to show for it. So that was difficult. And I guess like learning what it takes to actually create one of these things. So it turns out that we didn't know before that in order for one of these things to be valid, you need to test it out on like 2,000 people if you want it to be actually something that's truly game changing and good. And if you explained that to me before, I'd have been like, how are we going to test out on 2,000 people, children as well? But it turns out that we by the end of this month, we will be getting close to our 2,000 figure. But that has been like a long process to get behind. And that 2,000 testing out a product that's already been created. So it's like that's validating a product that's already been built. And so I guess I wouldn't necessarily call it a mistake because I don't regret going into the space that we're in, but I would definitely caution people who are thinking about creating their own business to learn from that, in the sense that it's much better to create a product that you can, from inception to first sale, takes less than 3 months. And I've heard this many times from other people, and I've given this advice myself and not listened to it myself. But I would say that that's like an incredibly critical piece, because I think Talamo is going to work, but it's lucky in a way that it is in this space, and it could have been much more unlucky. And so that's kind of mistake number one, is that the route that we're choosing doesn't MVP very well. The second is around hiring. It's extremely difficult to hire. Like, it's just by far the most difficult problem. I know it's probably a bit of a cliche because I'm sure everybody says this, but it's extremely difficult, and it's even more difficult in domains where you're not experienced yourself. So if you are trying to hire for expertise that you don't possess, and then you're trying to vet to see whether or not this person is who they say they are, that's really difficult. And it's difficult both from a skills issue, i.e. you don't necessarily know if they're going to do if they can do what they say they're going to do, and whether or not they might actually believe that they can do it, which is actually more dangerous because they're not trying to mislead you. They just think they can and they can't. And the second point is an attitude issue. Like, you can have the best person in the world, but like they might be doing 3 other jobs, and there's not really much you can do as an employer to stop them doing that. And so that is definitely, we've been through the ringer with hiring for sure. And it's the one guarantee that will destroy your business if you hire the wrong people, because not only from a kind of a quality perspective in building whatever you're trying to build, but also that's the thing that's just going to eat away any money that you've raised and all of that sort of stuff. So that would be another mistake. And to be honest, I think other things are just sort of like little mini learnings along the way. I would say that is probably those are probably the biggest mistakes that we've made.
So I think one thing that a lot of people are always interested in, myself included, is you had like a stable job where you're working, but also gave you the opportunity to explore this idea. When is the best time, in your opinion, to take the leap of faith and go full time with that project, and without sacrificing the stability that you have before?
The best thing about the situation that we live in now is that you don't actually have to be quite as binary as it. I think like in the past, you'd have probably been like, okay, I'm going to take the plunge. I'm going to quit my job and I'm going to get this person and we're going to set up an office and we're going to move in together and that's it. And like the risk level is way higher. Whereas nowadays, unless you have a job which is really all encompassing and it literally does demand all of your energy, you could probably carve out some hours in a day, especially if you work from home, that you don't have to choose one way or another. Just sort of accept the fact that you're going to be working hard for a couple of years. And then I would say that you almost have two, depending on the type of business that you have, your kind of full-time decision can probably fall into either like one of 2 points. Like either you have a business, your business model is one that requires initial upfront capital before it starts turning over any money, in which case you need to raise money before you can do anything. Or you have something which is making money immediately, and then that will just like wash its face and you could start taking some of that as your salary. So I would basically say, do as much as you can while you still have a job. And I'm as a sort of employer, I sort of wince when I say that a bit. But from if you're an entrepreneur yourself and you're working somewhere else, I think that's probably the best thing you can do. Even better if you have an employer who is receptive to what you're doing. Like I appreciate that that's not always possible, but if you do, that's great. And then you can get yourself a nice soft landing because you either raise money, which we did, or you can, just you're making enough revenue through your side hustle that you can go full time. I wouldn't say though that like you need to come to terms with the fact that you'll probably be making a lot less money than you were before. And that is something that I was making a lot more money when I was at that job than I am now. And so you have to humble yourself and say, okay, well, I can't go to as many nice restaurants. I can't do what I was doing before. You have to kind of like get yourself into that kind of entrepreneurial mindset. So I guess my answer would be you could go full time when you have another source of income, but also just don't have any like false impressions that you need to be making like a 6-figure salary when you go immediate. That's when you just jump to your startup. Like make the bare minimum you can to survive. Because I do think as well that there's a massive difference between being part-time and full-time. So you should definitely try and get to the point where you're full-time, but just there's no point in doing it before you're like you can give yourself a soft landing. So why would you not do that?
Following on to the topic of paying yourself and financing, I can imagine it's quite a rocky area when you're dealing with something that's kind of a moral issue like dyslexia. How have you approached a business that is a business and is not a charity, but also using and kind of monetizing an industry like that? Have you had any issues or people questioning your motivations there, or has it been smooth sailing?
I mean, it's an interesting question. I think that my personal view is that I don't think it's to have a real big impact. I don't think that you can. I think for-profit companies actually work better because you're not always. I think if your business model is that you are funded by like people giving you donations, I think through the virtue of that, like you're not ever going to be like as economical as you would be if you were like doing this purely based on sort of market demand. I think so. I don't have any kind of like ethical quandaries with like doing what we're doing. I think the main thing for me is that some people call dyslexia like a middle class condition and the reason for that is because people who don't have the means can't afford it, so they don't get a diagnosis. So it's not a middle class condition. It's just that people who don't have the means can't afford it. And so my just number one thing, and the thing that makes me feel like good about it, is if you were able to give an accurate identification of whether or not somebody has dyslexia, and then you give them really good recommendations, and it's like, depending on whether it's a school buying it or a parent buying it, it's like between 5 and 10 times cheaper than it would be, then and it's accurate. Like I feel like anybody in the industry, if they're being honest and they're being like they're not being kind of sort of had their own sort of incentives, being kind of driven by their own incentives, would admit that that's a good thing and it's a good aspiration to be driven by. So yeah, I think it's just better to have a for-profit company, because ultimately, if we are able to sustain ourselves, then we can keep on expanding, we can keep on growing, we can keep on raising money.
As I'm sure you're well aware, like the headwind against dyslexia is that stigma. So I'd be interested to know what other pushback you've had, if you've had genuine stigma against what you're doing and the relevance and the actual like condition itself.
Some pushback we've had is that like people think that we're trying to do people out of a job, something like that. Like we're like trying to automate an experience that is done by a human, but that's not true. Like I believe that if you have a really good dyslexia assessor and that's probably better to do it like that. Like it's to have a 3-hour assessment where they can go through and speak to you and have loads of different tests that they give you. I think that's a really good thing. Like I definitely think that's like, if you can afford it, that's an optimal experience. But so we've had a bit of pushback for people being like, oh, but you're just going to automate our jobs. It's like, it's not the case. There's a massive demand for dyslexia assessments. Like most dyslexia assessors have got like multi-month wait lists. So I don't think that's ever going to go away. I think actually it's just going to become more so. But the effect of it means that just like people don't get the support they need. And like you look at the statistics and some statistics say you're 5 times more likely to be in prison if you're dyslexic compared to if you're neurotypical, and you're twice as likely to drop out of school. And ultimately, all of this stuff gets like, a lot of this stuff gets augmented or solved for if you can get someone the identification and the support they need. That people do have just sort of like a reticence for change. And from my perspective, coming at the industry from an outsider's perspective, I see a lot of benefit in the kind of the new thought that we're coming in with, the new kind of perspective that we're coming into the industry with. And so I think that when I was going into this before, I would have been like, oh yeah, everyone's going to welcome this change with open arms, like, because we're trying to solve a real problem. And hey, look, like it's well intentioned. I'm dyslexic, but that hasn't been the case. Like, I think people kind of post-rationalize their perspective based on their incentives, if you know what I mean. So it's like, whilst it might sound like what their response is like a authentic one, and it's like for the kids or whatever it is, but it's kind of post-rationalized to be like, I'm worried about my situation here.
Yeah, I think you're preaching to the choir in Sol and I as well, because we both have neurodivergent diagnosis ourselves. So we really appreciate obviously the stuff you're doing. And when I was looking through your Instagram for Talamo, I found it really interesting, some of the stats on there, because yeah, I'm not as aware of dyslexia as much as Sol is, but like the example that was on there, like 1 in 10 people that are having it, and then there was also that prison statistic and stuff, which I found incredible. And you talk about the mission of Talamo being the accessibility, and then also there you just mentioned about the awareness. What is it specifically that you are doing to bring that new perspective into the industry and create that accessibility that others aren't?
Well, to begin with, it's like if you're a school, we basically say you should screen entire year groups like at a time. And so if you're a school, you might screen a year group of 150 people. And the cost of that compared to if you were to do it, it would be like over like between 10 and 20 times cheaper than if you were to do it like it from an in-person assessment. So what that basically does is it means it makes financial sense for a school to be able to do it, whereas previously it doesn't. And if you're a parent, you will be able to have an assessment for 5 or 6 times cheaper. So the first point is the price point. It's just a lot cheaper. It's worth noting that it's not exactly the same thing. Like if you have an in-person assessment, there are certain things that the government might be able to give you. For instance, when you go to university, you'll be able to get extra time. And if you might be able to get a free laptop. But our point is that you might not ever get any of that information. Like, so most people will never get that far. So if you have some kind of identification before that, that might be enough for you. Like that's all. That's ultimately our perspective, is that like as long as you know, then you can kind of work out. It doesn't matter if you got a free laptop, then you could just make your own kind of judgments and assessments on like, you know that you have this condition, so you can kind of move on from there. And so it's making it accessible from the fact that the price point is lower, but also it's a self-service digital test. So you can log on, you can have the child take the test, or you can do it in a classroom setting, and there's no wait time. It's all immediate, and it's just a lot quicker. So I think it's more kind of, it's both sort of usability and price point in terms of how we're making it more accessible.
What's the plan for the next few years?
So what I'm passionate about is creating a test or a series of tests that assess for multiple conditions at once, and then you have a tailored plan for what you should do about it. So my dream is that every person has the ability to know what neurodivergent condition they have. And even if it's not a neurodivergent condition, they just get to know a bit more about their cognitive profile. And so I guess the vision is that you as a normal person, you wouldn't discover this stuff unless you paid like £2,000 for an educational psychologist to give you all of these assessments. Whereas we might not be able to give the exact same level of like rigor and detail as an educational psychologist when you pay them £2,000, but maybe we could get 90% of the way there, but we have it at like £20 instead of £2,000, and that then just means that everyone can get it. So that's ultimately like the big aim. That like
to jump on to the final question, which we ask all of our guests, and obviously sent you before. So if you were to go back in time to maybe when you started university, or you can choose a time frame like maybe when you first came up with the idea, one thing you would do the same, one thing you would do differently, and then one thing you would tell yourself to motivate yourself.
One thing I'd do the same would be to like follow the same idea. Like I think there would be a temptation to say do something easier, and maybe if I was to do a business in the future, I would do something easier. But I think that I think it's a good thing as a first-time founder to do something really difficult, because you just learn so much more. So I would, whilst it's been painful, like I would choose to do that same. I think I would do differently would be that I would have also trust your gut a little bit more. I think as coming in as an entrepreneur when you're young, especially if you haven't been really senior in a job that you've been in before, the difference between being like someone who's got an idea and being someone who's like a CEO, manager of people, who's going to go and hire people who are way older than you, is that you might feel sort of slightly deferential to people. But like, I think you just need to get out of that mindset immediately. And then that would have had an impact on how I made better decisions. So I think the main thing I would have done differently is just to trust my gut a bit more, basically. And that would have probably allowed me to make better decisions. I think the thing I would say to motivate myself is like, you're solving or attempting to solve a real problem. Yeah. And just back yourself. Like, there's inevitably going to be people who don't see it the same way that you do, but like, you have a good idea, you have an idea of how to execute it, and just like, don't be derailed by people. Like, because I think previously I've been like trying to be like a good listener and open-minded and blah, blah, blah. But like at some point you need to just be like, fuck everyone else. I'm just going for it.
And I think that's such a good takeaway, because if you listen to what everyone else says, right, like at some point you're just never going to do anything. Like you got to actually have a bit of motivation and self-backing. So I think that's such a useful learning. And especially as I kind of alluded to, in the space that you're working in, and the actual tangible difference you're making first in terms of like accessibility as well. It's so interesting. So thank you very much. Very appreciative of your time.
Awesome. Cheers, boys. Really fun. Thank you.
Okay. Really interesting chat. Thought he was a great guy, obviously doing a pretty amazing thing. And I think as a business, it's going to work really well as well. So to move on to key takeaways straight away then. Sol, do you want to kick us off with the first one?
Yeah, sounds good. My first one is, I think I took away that there's never a good time to start something. There's never a good time to go and do something different. You're always going to be able to come up with a different excuse, a different reason, a different life problem that you've got, which means you can kick the can down the road. And Jamie said very nicely that you've actually got to back yourself to start it at any point and just go and do it, as opposed to put it off. So that was a big takeaway for me. I see you smiling, which makes me think that you've also done that one. I guess it's a good thing we keep copying each other.
Yeah, really annoyingly, it's another overlap. That's my biggest circled one. But fortunately, there were more, but definitely agree with that one. Yeah, I just summed it up as there's no perfect time to do it, I think was his exact quote. So definitely enjoyed that. And then I think I'll suggest the second one then, which is he mentioned, which is something that he said, being naive is a good thing to start with if you're going for an ambitious project. And he linked it in with the point that he said, entrepreneurship is like a muscle to train. And I think that's quite a good message to get across, because a lot of people, if they're thinking about starting a business, I think one of the biggest intimidating things about it would be like making mistakes, going wrong. So I like the idea that he went in and was happy to be naive and make those mistakes, because what he was wanting to achieve was potentially quite ambitious.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Nothing else to add on that, to be honest. It was yeah, strong point. Like the night. So what we're calling that just naivety, accepting your naivety and having an ambition.
Yeah, and then maybe, I don't know, maybe then we can make that a third separate takeaway. The third one being entrepreneurship as muscles to train, because it sounds like along the way when he was making all these mistakes and he was approaching it with naivety, he was learning from it, and it was literally like going to the gym to like you do to build up your beach muscles. He was going to build up his business brain, which I liked.
Yeah, I like that. Well, waiting for the beach muscles to come, but hopefully the brain works somehow. Let's keep that as a second one. I actually quite like that as a like a naivety that you can then build a muscle up to be like a experience in it. I've got a third one which is a bit rogue. I'm quite interested to see what you think about this one. But he spoke a lot about the importance of hiring. And I was like, that's actually something very different than a lot of the other guests we spoke about. And my takeaway from that actually is the importance of the people around you and the people you work with towards an ambition are equally as important to succeeding as having drive and having ambition yourself. So to kind of make that a takeaway is surrounding yourself with the right people, but also getting involved with the right people is one of the most fundamental things, I think, in taking a path less chosen.
I think I picked up on that same message when he was talking about his co-founder, because he was saying the way he approaches the business is very different to the way they do. And if it was just down to him, then he would just be like taking it for now and what they can do now, whereas the other person is better at looking into the future. So yeah, I like the idea that you can't just achieve it all. If you are building an ambitious business, you can't do it all by yourself. You've got to have the right people that complement each other in terms of how it works, with whether you think about the longer term or the shorter term.
Yeah, definitely agree. Strong. And just to add to that, I was actually the co-founder, the entrepreneurial event I was at this weekend. They said if you want to speak to investors, you actually have to have a co-founder. It's like a prerequisite to entering. And I think that's exactly on that point. If you want to be an entrepreneur, you can't really do it alone. So yeah.
Interesting excuse to flex. You went to a pitching competition this weekend.
Well, I had to get it in somehow, right?
Okay, well, I'm interested to hear how you sum up that second point, so I'm going to leave the summary to you.
Thank you so much. So if we sum up those 3 key takeaways, looking forward to this. So the first one is that there is never a good time to start, and you just have to back yourself.
Say there's no perfect time, because that's what he said.
Okay. Okay. So thanks for that, JB. Well, so to sum those up, we'll say first one is that there's no perfect time to start, and you've just got to back yourself. Second one is naivety in entrepreneurship is a good thing, and it's about building that entrepreneurial muscle in your brain by getting more and more experience. And then the third one is the importance of having diversity around you, diversity of thinking, and getting good people around you to excel at that path that's chosen.
Okay, great. I think that was a good conversation. I'm excited that we got to chat to him then, because I think if that business goes where potentially it could, he'll have much more important podcasts to be speaking to. So glad we got that conversation in. I enjoyed it. Thanks everyone for listening.
Yeah, appreciate it. And you can do all the like, subscribe stuff.
Perfect. Oh, I'm sorry. I mean, I can do it. I thought you were telling the listeners to do it. Okay, fine. Yeah, thanks again for listening, and like and subscribe and follow on all the platforms, etc., etc.